My name is Bill Flynn. I'm the Executive Director of the new Canaan Nature Center. Happy belated Earth Day. That was our inspiration for our timing for our illustrious speaker this evening. To thank a few groups that made it possible tonight. It was made possible by Penguin Random House, which is the publisher of the book. The New Canaan Library, who is our wonderful host for this evening on the Zoom. And Elm Street Books, our local bookstore. So please purchase a copy of your book through Elm Street Books, not only to support our local store, but that's where you can get a copy with a signed bookplate. Now to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker, as his Zoom box indicates, is Mr. Tony Hiss. He will be speaking about his newly published book, Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth. Tony was a staff writer at the New Yorker for more than 30 years, a visiting scholar at New York University for 25 years, has written 15 books, including the award-winning The Experience of Place. He's lectured around the world, and joining us from his home in Manhattan tonight, please welcome Tony Hiss.
Bill, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be in New Canaan, at least virtually, and to have a chance to talk with you. We thank Anthony for his work, and we're looking forward to being able to celebrate the new library soon. Beautiful day here in New York, windy, a little chilly, but spring, high spring. And as Bill said, it's the day after Earth Day, just a few hours after Earth Day. It's also William Shakespeare's birthday. Seems to me the perfect time and the perfect place to talk about confronting a great calamity, the biodiversity crisis, and how we can, by protecting half of all land and water, stave off a mass extinctions crisis. Half Earth to keep life alive. So I'd like to show a few pictures. As a way of getting started. Is that showing up on the screen? Good.
Yep, you're good.
The biodiversity crisis, sometimes overshadowed by the climate crisis, although the two are incredibly intertwined, is sometimes thought of as that other environmental crisis. 1 million species of animals and plants are at risk of extinction over the next few decades unless we do something. This, for instance, was the last male northern white rhino in Kenya who died a few years ago after his beloved keeper came in for one last rub behind the ear. This is Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, who died at the age of 101 a few years ago. These losses have led us to a new word which we would hope never to have in our vocabulary, an endling. An endling is the last of its kind, the final member of its species, a species that may have lasted for 1 million years or more. As Edward O. Wilson, the great champion of biodiversity and Harvard biologist, likes to say, every species is a masterpiece. One of the reasons we got into such trouble was because we had an idea that progress meant displacing things rather than adding on to things. This was a painting very famous in the 1870s called American Progress. Progress being that golden-haired young woman, not wearing very many clothes, who is floating across the continent from east to west, trailing telegraph wires behind her, accompanied by a stagecoach, a covered wagon, trains. I happen to like trains a lot, but they don't have to come at the expense of other things. And in this case, the bison are retreating into the darkness. The Native Americans are retreating, and a snarling bear in the lower left-hand corner is also retreating. Fortunately, quite some time ago, some people began to look beyond loss to a larger landscape that could contain abundance. One of the first was a craggy New England forester named Benton Mackay. In 1900, he celebrated graduating from college by bushwhacking up Stratton Mountain in Vermont, shinnying up the tallest tree he could find, and swaying there and looking out across the mountains. He suddenly was overcome by what he later called a planetary feeling. It seemed to him that there was a single place existing along the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, extending from Maine all the way down to Georgia. This was the first inspiration for the Appalachian Trail, a project which he announced 20 years later, and which was so successful that within 12 years, thousands and thousands of volunteers had created a footpath along the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, crossing 14 states. It's now 2,190 miles long. But for Mackay, that was only half the job. He thought of the peaks as the centerpiece of a much larger area he called the Appalachian Realm, potentially the Central Park of Eastern United States. This is the end papers from my new book, Rescuing the Planet. It's a lovely map that I had drawn up, and it shows the 4 largest landscapes here in North America. Mackay's Appalachian Realm being the smallest of the 4, actually. You can see it on the right, stretching from top to bottom. We're lucky here in North America that we have good bones, good mountain bones, which helps us to visualize the abundance and the amazing landscapes that are our legacy. Paralleling the Appalachian Realm to the west is the Rocky Mountains, and a Canadian activist and visionary had a similar vision to Mackay's in the 1990s. Harvey Locke saw a single landscape stretching from Yellowstone National Park, which is the very first national park ever created and invented in 1870, stretching all the way up to the top of the Yukon, Yellowstone to Yukon, he called it. And that began an amazing conservation movement that brought hundreds of different groups together, and they've now managed to protect at least 21% of that landscape. And they also see themselves as embedded in a much larger landscape, which stretches along the mountains from Mexico all the way up to Alaska, the spine of the continent, the Western Wildway. Then across the top of the continent is this extraordinary asset, the boreal forest in Canada and Alaska, probably the most intact and largest wildness left on the planet. 85% intact even today, far less cut over than the Amazon rainforest or than the Siberian taiga in Russia. It's 3,700 miles long. It's 1,000 miles from top to bottom. And you can fly, literally fly for hour after hour after hour over it and never see a single town or factory or even a hamlet. An amazingness at the top of our continent. Down at the bottom, the most recently identified large landscape, the so-called North American Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot, is a newcomer, only identified within the last decade or so. It's a good thing people started thinking bigger as soon as they did, because our traditional way of thinking about how to protect animals hasn't been working, and for quite some time. This is an article in the New York Times talking about the loss of species in national parks, which were supposed to retain species. And the article dates to 1988. It turns out that animals had a different idea about where they ought to be than our ideas of where they ought to be, and they were leaking out of these landscapes. And if development began to crop up around the national parks, then they couldn't get back in. So all of this has been leading to half Earth, a concept that even 10 years ago when I began writing this book seemed a bit ludicrous and far-fetched. Why would we want to protect half of the Earth for the other species? Well, because on the one hand, there are now some irrefutable scientific papers showing that most animals need at least 50% of their original habitat if they're going to thrive. Some need a little less, some need a little more. But we also have a kind of predictive math that Edward O. Wilson helped create, showing that if we protect 15% of a place, and at the moment, the continent of North America is about 15% protected, then we can only expect to hang on to a quarter or less of the animals and plants that got here before we did. Whereas if we bump that figure up to 50%, then at least 85 to 90% of all the animals and plants can be retained. Not everything, but very close to everything. Please look into the eyes of this fierce-looking Russian biologist, Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky. Vernadsky, not very well known here in the States, revered in Russia, where a Moscow subway station has been named after him, a crater on the dark side of the moon. In the mid-1920s, Vernadsky wrote the first sort of definitive book about the biosphere, that layer of life that contains every living thing that we know of at the surface of the Earth. Biosphera was the book. And he pointed out the three fundamental characteristics of the biosphere. It's ancient, 3.8 billion years old, if not older. It's enormous, seen from side to side, spreading around the world. But by its very nature, it has a third dimension as well. Its thickness, or rather its lack of thickness, its height, its thinness. Turns out that almost all of life is contained within a band between the bottom of the ocean and the top of Mount Everest. And that's a distance that's only 12.5 miles. If it was laid out horizontally, you could drive it in 20 minutes. In other words, you could drive from one end of life to the other in 20 minutes. So here we have this compound situation, something that's enormous, something that's ancient, but something that is vulnerable and by its very nature precarious. Astronauts who've been up beyond the atmosphere and looking back at the Earth have often had this feeling that they say changed them forever, seeing the beauty and the vulnerability of Earth in the same instant. It's sometimes called the overview effect. Well, now it's beginning, I think, to seep into us down here. It's more of an inner view. We still are making incredible discoveries as we roam around the world of species, fellow species that we never knew existed. A few years ago, some Indian scientists came across this spider, which they gave the scientific name Aerovixia gryffindori, because to them it looked unmistakably like the Sorting Hat in the Harry Potter books. And they thought if they gave it that name, maybe people would begin to feel more kinship with spiders and want to have them as neighbors. The bird on the right is an African griffin that can fly, a vulture that can fly so high, one of them once collided with a jet plane. But within this context of ancientness and immensity and thinness, we have to come back to the half-Earth blackboard, and we're confronted by 3 R's, 3 necessary principles that we seem to have to follow to keep life alive. Retain places that are still wild, like the boreal, restore those that were once wilder, and reconnect places that have been severed by human activity. The boreal, again. Suddenly the Canadian government, which didn't treat its Native Americans, the First Nations as they're called, much better than we did down here, but never displaced them. So they're still living on the land that they've occupied for 10,000 years or more, with an intimate knowledge of how it works. Suddenly, the Canadian government is turning to them because the Canadians had decided they would protect 17% of that country by the year 2020. They got nowhere close to it, maybe 11%. But by turning to the indigenous population, the First Nations, suddenly they have come up with the idea that these people in place can be the rangers of a vast new network of protected areas, the so-called indigenous protected areas, much larger than existing national parks up there. And within the next 10 years, there will be a whole network of them, of these immense sized protected areas. When I was visiting up there, and it's very hard even after having been there for a city boy like me to acknowledge how immense that place is and really wrap my mind around it. Talking with a friend one night, we thought in order to express its vastness, we had to even come up with a new vocabulary. Let's say Yellowstone National Park is the lowest unit we can think of. That's about 2 million acres. So we said one Yellowstone is 2 million acres. The next unit up is California. California is about 200 million acres. So 50 Ys equal 1 Cal. Why did we need such a measurement system? Because there are something like a dozen Cals that can be protected in these indigenous protected areas in the boreal forest. It's a way of making something beyond comprehension, at least thinkable. We do it astronomers do it. It's 93 million miles from the Earth to the sun, but it's only one astronomical unit. Makes it a little more comfortable to think about. We're also coming up with some older ideas in this urgent situation. North America not only invented the national park, it invented a second kind of national park, the so-called Green Line Park, meaning an area that's special and acknowledged to be special, but that doesn't have to be totally in public ownership. The earliest and most famous example of the Green Line Park is the Adirondack Park up at the north end of New York State, 6 million acres, but only 3 million acres of that are in public ownership. The rest are privately owned. But the idea is the place will change in a way that will respect its specialness, both by the private owners and the public owners. Well, the English took that idea away from us after World War II. They decided it was time they had a national park system so that they could make their land, they thought, fit for the heroes who had won World War II. And they latched on to the Green Line Park idea and set up a whole network of parks, national parks all across England. They've now protected something like 30% of that land, including beloved areas like the Lake District that William Wordsworth wrote about and adored so much. And they have a second tier called the Areas of Outstanding Natural Beauty, AONBs, which even they say is a clunky term. Well, in the 1970s, our National Park Service thought it was time to reclaim this idea, this other American idea for parks. And they drew up a list and a map of areas that weren't national parks, but that were treasured by the people who lived there. And I came across a copy of this and I thought of it as a treasure map. Well, it was going to be the great environmental initiative and the great environmental legacy of the second Jimmy Carter administration, except there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration because Ronald Reagan beat him in 1980 and the idea went back on the shelf for a while. Now it's being revived the Delmarva Peninsula on the east side of the Chesapeake Bay, so called because it's a tri-state area, part Delaware, Del, part Maryland, Mar, part Virginia, Va, has decided it will protect as an AONB, or an outstanding area, or OA, or they're saying oasis, Delmarva Oasis. They will protect 50% of that whole peninsula by the year 2030. If you can look carefully, you can see that there are some dots on the map near New Canaan. There's something called Housatonic and something called Hudson River here in New York State. I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about this picture, which has so much to say and has so much to do with coming up with ideas that cross-pollinate and that bring people together and collaborate. In 2007, an artist in Seattle named Sarah Bergman came up with what she called a planetary ecological judo project, or a massive design project. She created a mile-long corridor in that city between the campus of a university and a small woods, just on city pavement in planting strips along the sidewalk, a mile long, 12 feet wide, all devoted to native plants, which would attract pollinators and reconnect that severed area and create a landscape. Defragmenting the landscape, she called it. The idea was brought east in 2016 by Housatonic to Hudson, Hudson to Housatonic, a conservation partnership that combines the work of many land trusts across New York State and Connecticut. New Canaan joined and they set up pollinator pathways in the whole H2H area. New Canaan joined in 2019. And one of the first properties to be put on the New Canaan pollinator pathway is this Silver Mine Fowler Preserve, which had been the home for 30 years, as you guys know, of Jim Fowler, the beloved host of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. At its dedication for the preserve, Jim Fowler, then in his late 80s, said, "We have to start proving that we really care about what happens to our planet. And this is a pretty good place to start." These photos were taken by Susan Bergen last year, the first year in which pollinator pathway really was making an impact on that preserve. It's a way for people to rethink their lawns just by devoting even a small portion of it to the plants that will make it safe for birds, bees, and butterflies. The map at the bottom shows how the New Canaan pollinator pathway is connected across the state line into Westchester County, and how many towns in Fairfield County have already joined up. And then, of course, there's the yard sign that you can stick up and pat yourself on the back once you've joined the program. Birders have a term, spark bird. It refers to that moment, that instant that some bird at some point in their lives caught their attention and they were stuck, they were captured. Forever after that, there was this special thing in their lives. But that reconnecting to nature that Jim Fowler was talking about, it doesn't have to be a bird. It could be a wildflower, a pollinator plant. It could be a vista, a view. It could be what you see swinging from the top of a tall tree, the way it happened to Benton Mackay. It's available to anyone and everyone, just as getting involved in rescuing the planet is available to anyone and everyone who's interested. Thank you so much for having me here. And I want to thank Elm Street Books for being able to sell the book. We can't have a regular kind of old-time book signing these days, but we do have a social distancing special. They have some book plates that I've signed, which they'd be happy to affix into a book. And for anyone who would actually like a personalized, individualized book plate, all you have to do is tell people at Elm Street Books, they'll tell me your name, and I will write your name into a book plate and send it to them, and then they can send it out to you. Well, Bill, thank you for letting me show those pictures. And now we can resume our conversation.
All right. Oh, thanks, Tony. Yeah, there's so just hearing you for a few minutes, and obviously the book goes on for in a lot more detail. But I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, if you put them into the chat box, I would be happy to ask them on your behalf. So please type any questions in. I'm going to ask some of my own questions because I'm the host and I get to do that.
Yep.
So please add in any questions you have for Tony, and I'll be able to see them. So look forward to those. For layperson, can you define a little bit, because protecting the land, can you just define that a little bit more, because some people view that a little differently? Are you talking like a national park where no one's building anything on it, no human contact at all? Can you just elaborate on that, please?
No, I'm not talking about no people. In fact, that whole movement in Canada of letting the Indigenous people be the rangers for the parks couldn't exist if they weren't there. Mucklucks on the ground, they're calling it up there.
That's a good name.
But the idea is landscapes that can be shared in a way so that the animals can go about their business and we can go about our business, and in a balanced kind of way. In some cases, there will be very few people on such landscapes. And in fact, one of the reasons why 50 by 50 doesn't seem so outlandish in North America is because less than 40% of the continent is devoted to human purposes at this point. Also, as I said, when I first started writing about this, it seemed far-fetched, the notion of half Earth. But now the Biden administration has embraced the idea of 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the country by the year 2030 as a first step. 56 other countries have already endorsed that idea. And it looks like in October, there's going to be a meeting in China at which 196 different nations will meet to embrace the same goal, 30 by 30. And suddenly you hear people saying, oh, 30 by 30? Well, why not 50 by 50? Interestingly, when I started work on the book, one of the people I was lucky enough to meet was Edward O. Wilson, the great conservationist. And he was sort of throwing out the idea of a vast number. I came up with the term half Earth, actually, talking to him. But at that point, he was saying, in his mind, it was what in the business community is sometimes called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal, something you throw out there. Not sure you'll ever get quite that far, but at least it'll wake people up and make them start thinking. Sometimes it actually works, like President Kennedy saying, let's put a man on the moon in a decade, which we did.
We talked about this a little bit earlier, is a lot of people, you're talking on such a global scale, and it is for some people like, well, what can I do? So I really appreciate what you put in about our local efforts, that local organizations like the Nature Center, the Land Trust, Beautification League, Garden Club, Grace Farms, New Canaan Library. There's a lot of groups involved in our pollinator pathway, so it's not just a land trust or nature center initiative, but the idea that people can do this sort of work on their own properties or at their own home and contribute to it at a local town level. And if more and more people did that on the local level, that can add up to what you're talking about.
Yes, and it's not going to happen until as many people as possible get involved. And one of the things that made this book a pleasure to write was finding how much is actually happening already, and how many people are working on this, and how many people who traditionally didn't work together are beginning to work on it. So that, for instance, in the Appalachians, people whose real interest is hiking and walking are making common cause with people whose interest is in protecting the land and the landscape and the place for animals. These were communities that often looked askance at each other. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Appalachian realm itself is not yet fully secure is because Benton MacKaye, the great Benton MacKaye, was in the 1930s sort of shouldered aside by one of his disciples who said, no, our job is to create this path. He is said, left behind him 2 trails, the Appalachian Trail, because he was a genius at getting the trail built, and a trail of bruised egos from Maine to Georgia. So now his successors are beginning to go back to Mackay's original vision and take up that, over the next 100 years, that task of protecting the rest of the Appalachian realm landscape.
We do have a global question from Ken Hecht, who's on the call. His question or his statement is, Africa is one of the most endangered natural places because of the exploding human population. How do you deal with that and still provide food for people there? So good question of the
it's very
humans
complex.
And natural.
It's hugely complex. And we have to be able to grow enough food to feed even more people on no more land than we're growing it on today. There seem to be a lot of things making that more and more possible. For instance, they've just discovered that seagrass in the ocean near to the shores, the seeds of seagrass actually have 50% more protein in them than rice. Who would have thought that? We do have to expect all these people to come. If we can plan cities that are livable and respect their own ecosystems, that will be of assistance too. But clearly it's a vast task, just as combating the climate emergency is a vast task. Why I found it so hopeful is that so many people are already so fervently engaged in this and making such good progress. Maybe North America has its own problems and its own lack of problems, but it seemed to me that our home continent was a good place to start. If we invented the national park and we invented the Green Line Park, we have things to contribute to the rest of the globe.
Yeah, that was what you were saying with the seagrass seeds. Reminded me of, we had a professor on about a month ago named Edward Melillo, and he was, in his book, he was talking about the amount of water and acreage it takes to raise cattle versus something like crickets, which I know is a huge move. Not a lot of people think it very appetizing, but the same amount of product it takes, I don't remember the exact numbers, but hundreds of acres versus like 2 acres, and the amount of water is a fraction of it. And so, to your point, there are people working on these issues if you're willing to eat bugs more, I guess.
I haven't had a cricket burger myself yet, but
well, you can go to places like Whole Foods and you can buy cricket flour, and you can make cricket flour pancakes. If I guess that's everyone's homework if you want to go try out something like that. But it's,
have you tried it, Bill?
I've had actual crickets and mealworms. If you can go on Amazon and order these things, and they flavor them with, you can get basically all your chip flavors you can get on your insects. So you can get barbecue or salt and vinegar is my preference.
Okay. I'll put it on the list.
It's ideas like that, or the seagrass seeds, that's the only way the population of the earth is not going to, I mean, plummet, even in times of global pandemics or famines or wars, and the population keeps rising. And so these issues of coming up with exactly what Ken was asking, how do you protect all this land while still, having humanitarian efforts
That's
succeed?
right.
So
But
it's,
the,
yeah.
the pollinator pathway movement is a good example too of how things that you thought were gone can be reclaimed. The fact that the idea began in a city and then spread to towns and suburbs is in itself interesting. And that that so many people can come together doing this, because it's been estimated that if all the lawns in America devoted half of their acreage to pollinator planting, something like 20 million acres would be restored to natural areas. And that's 20 million, 10 times the size of Yellowstone. That's 10 Ys right there.
And you do, we talked about this the other day, you do see that. I noticed it in New Canaan. We're on Owen Ridge for everyone listening. If you drive north, up 124 out towards New York, on the right-hand side, there's properties that have turned half their lawns into these native fields, and it's exactly what you were just describing. And you don't have to take away your whole lawn, but if you take part of it, and there's lots of people who are doing this now, they can be aesthetically pleasing. They can be low maintenance, and once they take hold, they can manage themselves, and they're going to support a whole lot of natural wildlife on your property. So,
well, the whole idea for the Merritt Parkway was originally that it would be a drive through the countryside, and the right-of-way, the broad right-of-way, was maintained as a beautiful natural landscape. We could do that to all our roads. We could do it to our train lines even. There's no reason why you can't see something that's taking care of the planet from the window while you're getting from one place to another.
Well, we're seeing it in a lot of people who are listening tonight. And Copia is a nursery just north of New Canaan, and they were one of the only nurseries who would supply native plants. And it was, at first, they had a few customers, but just in the last few years, because of the conversations that keep happening with talks like this in groups that have promoted the pollinator pathway, they can't, I mean, their native stock is always low, and they keep selling out of these things because people demand them. So it follows along the lines of education is a huge part of these conversations and getting people to change, and it's really important. So, these sort of things do work, and they do hit home with people.
Well, there's that spark bird moment, and it doesn't have to be a bird. Something that calls out to, I think what got me started writing about this was just the plight of the animals. And I didn't really know when I started if this was something we could overcome or do something about. But as I said, I was able, after I met Ed Wilson, to meet some of the people he was in touch with, like a wonderful character down in the panhandle of Florida named MC Davis, who called himself an old dirt road panhandle guy. He was actually a multimillionaire commodities trader, but he'd started out playing poker to raise his first stake before he made his money. And he was stuck in a traffic jam one day in Florida, fuming and furious, and looked out the window of the car and saw this sign on a high school billboard that said Black Bear Seminar. And he thought, anything's better than this, and he peeled off went into the auditorium and he said, there were a couple old drunks sleeping it off and a few Canadian tourists who'd gotten lost and were looking for some day-old donuts. And up on the stage were these two remarkable women talking about the plight of the Florida black bear, which is a subspecies of black bear, and its native habitat, this extraordinary forest system down there called longleaf pine. So that was his moment. He got caught, and the next day he sent them enough money for them to do 2 years worth of work, and they were immediately suspicious what was happening. Never had a donation like that before, and they said, "What are you looking for? What do you want?" And he said, "I want something very specific. I want you to give me a list of the 100 most important environmental books because I'm way behind and I got to get up to speed." And he spent the next year reading those books, and then he went out and bought 51,000 acres of played out peanut farms and began replanting this longleaf pine forest, which had largely disappeared right after the Civil War, when the bankrupt plantation owners had suddenly started cutting down all the trees. It's probably the reason why Scarlett O'Hara said, "I will never go hungry again." And he started planting 500,000 seedlings a year. By the time I caught up with him 12 or 13 years later, the place still looked rather scruffy, but he was saying, well, it's year 13 of a 300-year project.
Right.
And MC died a few years ago, but he endowed the project with enough money to keep going for another 280 or whatever it is years. And so that's the kind of spirit I kept running into all across the country, and why the book turned out to be a hopeful, optimistic book.
And so you just gave such a great optimistic comment and story of that. What kills me is all of those efforts of restoring the Florida black bears, and then you hear these news stories of they open up hunting season in certain areas for black bear for a day, and something like 300 of them get killed in a day, and it's horror. Those are, I mean, that's the you have someone doing all of that effort, and then it seems we get in our, which is usually the problem, humans, we get in our own way a lot.
Well, you're right. There is this. It's going to be a choppy time. There are riptides and backtides, but at the same time, well, Montana just, I think, opened a hunting season for wolves. But next door in Colorado, they just passed a referendum reopening the state to wolves. So there's going to be a lot of backing and forthing, I think. But
well,
what I'm seeing is that the general tide is in a positive direction, despite all the.
I agree.
Setbacks.
It gets to Ken's question earlier of, how do you, because in Montana, where it's a huge ranching state, of course, that's what drove most of the wolves out of North America, were you protecting our livestock. And so, it's which brought in all the coyotes, because the wolves kept the coyotes away. So we change the ecological landscape so much faster than evolution can even try to keep up with it. And so then we have humans that try to overcome that, and it's just impossible to sort of predict. But at least all the efforts are encouraging, but it's very complicated.
One of the places I got to visit was Ted Turner's ranch out there in Montana, the Flying D, and it's sort of a wild working landscape. They've brought bison back in as a cash crop, but at the same time, it's a huge herd of purebred bison, and they haven't minded that wolves have found their ways back onto the property. They don't see that as a contradiction, because the ranch is a money-making proposition, but it's run by world-class conservationists and biologists. So again, here's groups that were thought to be irreconcilable working together to make something happen. And
it seems, and throughout your book, you've gone, I mean, obviously you did it for over 10 years and had to travel so much, but you've just mentioned a few of these stories down in Florida and in Montana. Are there any other ones that come to mind that were very memorable for you?
Well, there's a woman in Mexico, northern Mexico, named Valere Clark. Um, she was from New York originally, and she, years and years ago, bought a played out ranch in southern Arizona, and then bought some similar properties in northern Mexico. The problem there was it was bone dry, dusty place. It had been overgrazed by cattle. Well, it was easy enough to get rid of the cattle, but it was still dry as dust. It wasn't that it never got any water, it was that water sluiced through in a sort of monsoon way twice a year, but disappeared, dashing down large gulches and gullies. But there was one little spot on the place where the water seemed to be pooling. In fact, she wanted to get rid of it. I happened to have some people working for her who came from southern Mexico. And she said, could you do anything about it? And they said, sure. Well, it turned out they were from this area that had a 500-year-old tradition of stoneworking. They could put together stone walls, dry stone walls, no mortar, but so tight that they were watertight. And they threw this across this pool, and suddenly the water began to seep in instead of rushing away, and green stuff began growing. And she had her idea. If we could put in these gulches a series of little steps and stepping stones made out of these walls, the trencheras, as they were called, made by the trencheristas, maybe we could do something. Well, it was something. Suddenly the water was gentled and no longer fierce, and the banks of these places began to become green and attract all kinds of animals, now including bear. She said, I wanted water, but all I had to work with was stone. So she made stone produce water. There are amazing stories like this wherever you look for them.
Well, was there any, did you have, you keep describing what was it, the spark bird moment? Do you have that?
It was sort of more cumulative, I think, for me. Although there is a place in suburban Boston that really spoke to me. 100 years ago, a disciple of Frederick Law Olmsted, the great landscape architect who designed Central Park and the parks in Boston, had the idea of taking Olmsted's ideas a bit beyond the city limits. And he realized that there were still some natural areas in the vicinity of Boston that were unchanged. Small, but there. And he thought, these are as important to our culture and our legacy as great paintings or great books. But instead of having libraries or museums, maybe we could set up little areas that would protect these landscapes. That was, in fact, the very first land trust. That's where it got started. And the trustees of reservations, it's called. And one of these areas was a little grove of oak trees that had been there before the Pilgrims arrived, since before the Pilgrims arrived, the same trees, called the Waverly Oaks. And so he set up a little preserve around the Waverly Oaks. The unfortunate thing there, we talk about balance. A newfangled trolley line had just reached the edge of the Waverly Oaks. Folks came flocking out from Boston to see these wonderful trees and loved them to death, trampled them. By the time I got there, and there's a wonderful guy who lives in the area named Jim Levitt, who's its great protector, there's one Waverly Oak left, but there it is, this tree that is far older than the people on the Mayflower and will probably live for another 300 and 400 years. And you just stand in its shade and you realize maybe the town of Brookline is the thing that's coming and going, whereas what stays is the tree. So that moment spoke to me, this beautiful oak tree. Still there and going to be there now because it's fully protected for the rest of its 300 or 400 more years.
Well, we were talking before about how one of the silver linings of COVID was the only thing people could do is get out to their local parks or land trusts, or it was the only place people could go. And so I know we saw here is a lot of reconnection. People forgot that they could have a good time with their family just going for walks, and the connection is obviously the most important thing that's going to lead to people. You protect what you love, and you can't love something without a connection to it. So,
Well, it happened to me just outside my own building in Manhattan. There's a brilliant New York naturalist named Timon McPherson, and he took me for a walk and stopped me within 2 feet of the door of the apartment building and said, well, here's the ecosystem, look around. And I wasn't looking in the proper place, but in the cracks of the sidewalk are these tiny little ruderal plants, they're called, that are just there. They just keep coming back. And there were ants, of course, crawling around the sidewalk, E.O. Wilson's favorite creatures. And then you think, well, that could be extended. It isn't just a matter of street trees or even pollinator pathways, the way Seattle got started. We now can build green roofs. We can build green walls. The green wall idea seems to have been invented in the 1930s by E.B. White, the great writer's brother, who was a professor out in Illinois. And I found a letter from White to his mother saying, well, every family's got a few crazy brothers. Our brother seems to have come up with an idea that may be pretty good for building walls that have plants growing up. There's so much that's happening and so much that's possible and so much that I think I feel a sense of buoyancy, a sense of urgency, but a sense of buoyancy at the same time.
I mean, there's certainly, if you want to find a lot of inspirational stories about how innovative people are being with these problems, I mean, it's out there. It just needs to keep going.
Well, I managed to sluice a lot of it into my book, so I hope people will want to pick it up and feel like they can get with it too. There are big umbrella groups. E.O. Wilson himself set up something called the Half Earth Project. There's another one people out west and in Canada have set up called Nature Needs Half, with the same goal. But then as we keep saying, there are so many things happening wherever you are, right around you. And if you don't know how to get started, you can just Google whatever it is you're interested in, whether it's hiking or birds, and there's groups around you that would love to have your participation. And then as soon as you get involved, you are part of rescuing the planet.
Well, even the pollinator pathway, and we'll end in a few minutes. So if anyone has any last minute questions, get them in quick. But to be part of a pollinator pathway, you can put 4 big planters out on your front steps. You don't even have to convert your grass lawn into a natural field. But you know, it is simple to get involved. Obviously, the more you do, the better. But there's huge organizations, there's small ones on your local level. They're all important. So thank you for bringing attention to these issues. And
city people can plant window boxes. It's as simple as that.
Well, we have something called tower gardens here. Like we do with the kids there. It's all encased in one, you know, it's 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall. And the water goes up the middle, and then it feeds all the little box plants down, and the lights hang down around it. I mean, there's a lot of systems like that you can grow inside anywhere. So, I mean, there's a lot of good things happening.
There you go.
So please, if you enjoyed, everyone go to Elm Street, pick up the book, and I just want to thank you very much.
Sign a book plate to anyone who's interested.
Yep, call Elm Street. So as soon as pandemic ends, let's invite you up here, Tony, and so people can meet and hear more about it, because there's a lot more you weren't able to touch on that's in your book. So
It's a
really
date.
appreciate it.
Bill, thank you so much for this. Very enjoyable to talk to you.
Easy subject for me. This is what, I run a nature center, and we're hopefully part of this solution also. So thank you everyone who joined the call tonight. Thank you, New Canaan Library, for hosting the Zoom, Penguin Random House, and of course, Tony Hiss. And please pick up the book. Thank you everyone
Bill.
for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.